Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to the Muslim Roundtable Show. My name is Reda. I'm your host today, and we're going to talk about the issue of Palestine. Let me introduce our guest today. On my right is Mr. Basil Hantash, who is a resident physician at Stanford University. On my left here is Mr. Youmans, who is a Palestinian activist. And on my far right is Ms. Nadine Reda, who is our Muslim Roundtable media consultant. And on my far left is Mr. Dr. Michael Nathanson, who is the Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Valley Medical Center in San Jose. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you. First, I want to start off with a little model I have here. This is a building. I just want to ask, does anyone know what is this building called? Anyone?
Mosque of Omar.
Mosque of Omar? What's the more popular name? Anybody?
Alexa. Dome of the Rock.
Dome of the Rock, very correct. Mr. Will made a little slight error there. Mm-hmm. This is always confused with Al-Aqsa Masjid. And unfortunately, many Muslims also, they don't even know what the Al-Aqsa Mosque really looks like. So hopefully we have some footage of that, which we'll show to you pretty soon. But this is the Dome of the Rock. Our friend Dr. Basil Hantash, he recently went on a trip. Yes. And what's the current situation in the Palestine right now?
Well, since the Intifada began in 2000, every day the situation is getting worse. Conditions are deteriorating, not only politically but medically, which was my focus for the mission. Joined a non-profit, non-political organization called the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund recently, and they provide medical relief to the kids in Palestine who are suffering. And we were in the hospital in Gaza, Shifa Hospital, and the conditions there are severe. There's no antibiotics to provide for infections. There's no heart medications for heart attacks. It's really dramatic. Infections.
And most of the people in the hospital are mostly children and innocent civilians who get hurt in the crossfire, correct?
Well, there's a lot of myth through the media in this country and around the world that most of the casualties are adults who are militants. That actually is very false. While I was there were several assassination attempts made in Gaza, and most of the victims were innocent children and sometimes innocent adults who were just casual pedestrians or school kids coming back from class or taxi cab drivers. And we have many examples of that in the last couple of years.
It seems like, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people is so general and so blanket that it affects all segments of society. Every aspect of people's lives of the Palestinian people is affected by Israel's military control of them. They like to say that they have targeted assassinations, but when they do these targeted assassinations, they end up killing like a whole family of the person who they're trying to kill. So although they try to make it seem like everything's surgical or tactical or precise, the truth is that the occupation affects everybody in all aspects. As he was talking about, medically people are affected. Water use and unemployment is, 60%. There people can't even go to work because of the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian people. And they wonder, why is there a conflict? People can't go to work, people can't go to school, people can't even leave their house.
They're actually currently, people are learning from home phone calls. Teachers will call the different homes and conference students because they can't go to school. And Palestinian heritage has been based on education, and that has been passed on through time. So as a fabric society, it's critical for them to maintain that essence of education. And so families are doing everything they can to create a small, safe environment in which they can learn, and that's being facilitated through phone calls now, which is a disaster.
So let me ask Mr. Youmans, how do you think the conflict affects us here in America? What do you think?
I think it affects us on many different levels. The most important level, I think, in terms of how it relates to the American people is financially.
Because the state of Israel is dependent on the United States for financial and economic purposes. Like when the economy of Israel is on the downswing, the United States will kick in a couple $1 billion. So far in the history of Israel, it's received about almost $100 billion. We're talking $3 to $5 billion a year, which amounts to, I think, something like $70 million
Actually, the
per
recent
day.
estimates
150.
were above 150. They've been recently updated to 174 million.
Yeah.
Billion, excuse me.
And
billion.
the key to this is, you know, we go to schools here, especially like in some cities, and they're decrepit. There's no books. People can't even get health care in this country. And the average Israeli citizen is receiving about $2,000 to $3,000 a year in aid from the United States. You know, this is money that could be used here to better our lives here, but instead it's going to support the Israeli government, which in turn uses the money to support its militaristic oppression of the Palestinian people. So not only is the money not being used here, but it's being used for purposes that we would never tolerate. We would never tolerate if the American government was stopping us from going to school or stopping us from getting hospital supplies, you know, but that's what Israel does towards the Palestinian people.
Okay, Dr. Nathanson, you were actually born in Israel, Palestine. What are your thoughts about the whole conflict?
Well, my thoughts really don't differ from what you heard so far. I think that the root of all evil there is the occupation. I mean, it's so elementary. It's a no-brainer. Israel cannot rule over other people. It's just unacceptable.
So what do you think they have gotten away with for so long? How do you what's the reason behind that?
Well, the reason, again, you can say it's very simple. It's simple, not simple, but if you look at the root of the conflict, basically there were, it was a conflict between two nationalistic movements, and those who controlled those movements had a maximalist viewpoint. The Palestinians historically did not want any Jews living in Israel or living in Palestine because they were afraid, and eventually their fears were justified, that the Jews would take over and they would be disinherited. The Zionist movement, which was the Jewish nationalist movement.
Let's define that word Zionist. A lot of people is throwing that around. What does it actually mean? What does the word Zionism actually mean?
Zionism was a movement that started in Europe in the late 1800s. Well, they came from religious homes, decided that the solution to the malaise of the Jewish people in Europe is to have a national home. And the question was where to create a national home, and there were thoughts thrown around. Some people said it should be in Argentina, some people were in Uganda, and then people said, aha, we have a Bible and our history is really rooted in the Holy Land, which is true, but said, well, we have to rectify the injustice that was caused us over centuries and millennia. So that's why they called Zionists, because it was the people who loved Zion and they wanted to renew Jewish life in the Holy Land. So,
but at the expense of an indigenous people.
Well, no, I understand. Well, what I'm saying is that first of all, the agenda was to renew Jewish life in the Holy Land. And of course, most of the people who led that movement, foremost Herzl, who was an assimilated Jew, really, who was not religious at all, his contention was that it's an empty country, that even when after he visited Palestine in 1904 and met with the German Kaiser there, in his diary did not even allude to Palestinian indigenous population. So the whole concept of the Zionist movement was to ignore and not pay attention to the indigenous Palestinian population.
Well, the Zionist slogan at the time was Palestine as a people without a land, for a land without a people.
That's
when
right.
in fact there was a people there, and then when they finally got there and realized there were people there, then they started to make all these justifications, like they're not making productive use of the land, and they basically built up a rationality to get the people out of there, to move the Palestinian people out.
It was actually very violent. Appeared in Die Jürgenstadt, that was Herzl's his diary, essentially, which turned into the document that led to the doctrine work for Zionism. And if you read that closely,